Well, what contaminates a life? Have you ever felt contaminated? Well, Jesus had one of those many altercations with the Pharisees and the scribes. And this is the situation. We had gotten Jesus away from the feeding of the 5,000 across the Sea of Galilee, had another altercation, and then we talked about those come to Jesus moments. Are you really for Jesus or not? Are you really going to stay with Jesus, or are you going to go off with the crowd? Because Jesus wants your faith, your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that was a come to Jesus moment, and a lot of people left. They went to follow the crowd. But there was a core group that stayed. And now Jesus, we're in a different gospel. We're in the Mark gospel today. And Jesus is still being drawn to the crowds. The crowds are still coming. No matter where he is at, the crowds are coming. And so he has gone to the marketplace. Now, it's not just because he needed to get some food. In the marketplace, everybody who needed to be healed would go there. People who were injured or hurt or had a birth defect, in whatever way they were sick. And they would lay them out on mats because all they could do was beg for money, beg for food. And so they would go to the marketplace because everybody be at the marketplace, and Jesus was there. And what do you know? People knew Jesus was coming, word got out, and so more people came to the marketplace, and they crowded into that place so that they could be healed. And so they would crowd up to Jesus to touch him. If he couldn't reach out and touch them, they would just touch the hem of his garment, and their faith would make them well. And so he left the marketplace, and he passes by the Pharisees and the scribes who are there ready for him. They are always ready. And sure enough, they start their meal, and they don't wash their hands. Well, okay, I'm a public health nurse. I know you should wash your hands. But what they were complaining about was this. When Jesus touched somebody who was ill, he became unclean. He became contaminated by simply touching them or them touching him. And so he could not enter the synagogue. He could not partake in any food at all until he had been ritually purified by a certain type of water that he had to use. And so they're on the road traveling. They eat their food, and they're at him and with the book and saying, look, you have not followed the rules. And he has some altercation with them about what rules are and what really contaminates a soul. And then he turns away from them and he turns to the crowd like you. And he says this. This is in Mark chapter 7. And we're going to start with verse 14. Jesus called the crowd again and said, listen to me, all of you, and understand. Nothing outside of a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, the things that come out of a person contaminate the person. Now we're going to skip down to verse 21. It's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, and foolishness. All these things come from the inside and contaminate a person in God's sight. You see, according to the Pharisees and the scribes, Jesus was unclean. Jesus was a sinner. Think about that. God's Son was being called a sinner. Well, last week we talked about those moments in our lives, those come to Jesus moments that meet us, and we have to face the truth about them because we are about to be forever changed. They are moments, and some of you talked about those come to Jesus moments in your own life, those situations that are changing who you were into something else. And these are moments that are usually outside of ourselves, although maybe they might be our own doing. But a lot of them, like my mom's dementia, was not my doing. It just happened. Sometimes it's beyond our control, like a job loss or some fight you had at work and you didn't even know what happened. Those are come to Jesus moments. And we always say, remember this, that Jesus comes to us in those moments. That's when Jesus comes to us. There are situations that have changed us forever. You know, I've been forever changed when my mom's dementia set in, when my dad's Parkinson's set in. But there's also the come to Jesus moments when we send our kid off to college, or for those of you who are sending your youngest off to kindergarten. That's a big come to Jesus moment. But today I want to talk about something else. Another come to Jesus moment that's not about situations, not about the situations that we face, but the truth that we have to face about ourselves, who we are, who we're not, who we failed to be. You see, some people claim to know who we are, okay? Some people claim to know who we are. And they say this saying, all you have to do is open up their refrigerator to tell who they are. Okay, so when we were dealing with my mom's changing memory, the kids and I would take the responsibility of going to her little apartment to open up her fridge and peek inside, which was a scary thing. It looked and it smelled an awful lot like this. In fact, if this had green, slimy, moldy things coming out of it, that would be my mom's fridge. There was stuff. She was so afraid that she didn't have enough, so she would save every scrap of food that she had, and she put it in a paper dish, uncovered, and put it in the back of the fridge. Do you know what a cinnamon roll looks like after 5 months in the fridge? In the back? Well, you don't even know what it looks like, because it looks different. And the milk was always sour, and things had mold and growing out of it, that brown, fuzzy, green stuff that almost moved. And inside, though, was a story of who my mom had become. Now, for sure, her fridge was always filled. It was always packed, and there was always stuff in the back that was growing mold. That was my mom. But the amount of mold and the amount of stuff that was stuffed in there said more about her financial situation than her dementia. See, we had that come to Jesus moment that life was changing, but it also was financially, she could not navigate buying groceries. And so she saved everything. So we had the opportunity to clean out her fridge. And by the time we cleaned out everything on her food that was no good or had expired not by months, but by years, they had expired by years. And we looked at her cupboard and did the same. Her shelves and her fridge were virtually empty. It was another come to Jesus moment. What was my mom eating? What was she eating? But you know what? It's easy to open up a fridge like that belongs to somebody else and sit there and poke fun at them, isn't it? It's easy to go to your mom's house or your sister's house or your brother's house or your kid's house and open up that fridge and see what's growing in the back. Or open up your kid who just graduated from college and you open it up and the only thing they have are 2 cases of Coke Zero, sriracha sauce, and Chipotle. And that's all that's in the fridge. You know, the truth is that my fridge has looked like this from time to time. How many would say the same? Okay, there's only a few of you who are being honest. Okay, only a few are being honest. The truth is, there are times in my life when I get too busy, and the leftovers that were there for the next meal ended up being pushed aside because we had kids and we were busy going off to games, and we never got to the leftovers because we went right from work to the game, and we never got the leftovers. And so I know the truth about myself if I look inside my fridge too, or my spare bedroom, or my garage, or in the basement with all those boxes I've never unpacked in 20 years. They're still there. You know, eventually we are the stuff that we have in our homes. This all tells who we are. But you know what? Eventually it will all spill out. And somebody will discover who we are by what we save and what we hoard and what we stuff into the back of our fridge. And those are the secrets about who we are, the stuff that we can't let go of because something has contaminated us and we can't let go of it for some reason. And those are our come to Jesus moments about ourselves, the truth about ourselves. You see, Jesus laid out all these ugly words. And most of the time, I'm a fan of Jesus, but when Jesus lays out some words that start pointing at me, I get nervous because he laid them all out about what things really contaminate us. You know, it's not about whether you do all the rituals for church, or it's not that you put on a stole or you don't put on a stole, or you put on a robe or you don't put on a robe, or you speak here or you speak there. None of that is about the soul that Jesus is talking about. None of that. No, what contaminates a person are these things, and they were very blunt words. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults. And then he adds these two, arrogance and foolishness. Arrogance and foolishness are in the same bucket as murder and adultery. No, I want to let you know I'm not wanted by the FBI, okay? I'm not under investigation, and there's nothing in my fridge that would show that. But I want you to know that I do worry about those things on that list, because somewhere on some day I am one of them. And I look and I think, am I too tarnished, too contaminated for Jesus? And I bet you might be surprised. But I know there are times I question whether I am worthy because of my own contamination. You see, while I was facing that come to Jesus moment about the situation with my mom and her dementia, and yet one more thing that was changing in her life, I was also facing a personal come to Jesus moment about who I was. Because during that same period of time, my divorce was made final. You know, when it rains, it pours. And divorce is one of those ugly words. It wasn't called out specifically, but according to the rule books of the traditional Christian world, divorce is under that list of immorality. I don't know why, but it's under the list. See, I felt contaminated by that very word. It just gives me shudders to even say it, that I no longer measured up to the church that I had grown up in. I was outside the standards, the traditions. So I wondered, was I too contaminated to come through those doors and sit in the pews? And there were reminders. There were critics who would remind me, not so much in our pews, but at work. There were critics who reminded me that if I had been a good wife, I wouldn't have failed. That marriage was higher calling than the lives of the people in the marriage. It was my come to Jesus moment that I wasn't as valuable as the tradition of marriage. And I have to admit that I felt a lot like that stuff crawling in the back of the fridge. I was contaminated. My soul was broken, and I hid it every time I walked in the pews. And remember, in every come to Jesus moment, Jesus comes to us in that moment. See, Jesus knows our inside and comes to repair it, repair our souls, if we just reach out to touch Jesus like the people in the marketplace who just touched his hem of his garment. Faith will heal our brokenness. Faith will transform our broken souls into something whole. It'll decontaminate it because Jesus has come to do that. You know, sometimes we've had this talk with some people here, and sometimes I say, I wish we would just start every service with the same way an AA meeting starts. Hi, my name is Terri, and I am a sinner. And then you would all say, hi, Terri, and you would give me a greeting, and you would give me an identity beyond the stuff in my fridge. I would have an identity that's not the slime that I feel. I would then go on to claim what I have done in that week that made it difficult to come into church, that was challenging for my soul, and everybody could take a turn. We talk about those come to Jesus moments in our life where we felt contaminated, and we would release them, and Jesus would forgive them. And others would do the same. We'd tell what we felt contaminated by, the things we said, the things we did, or the things we didn't say or didn't do. And we would toss them all out of our fridge of our souls, and then we would let Jesus heal them. So I wondered, what would you toss out in your come to Jesus moments about yourself? What come to Jesus moments are you dealing with now, or the ones that you've never dealt with? What ugly truths need to be forgiven by God's grace? Well, I was reading this scripture, I also was reading a book by Henry Nouwen, and I love this guy. He's just a beautiful scholar. He's now passed away, but his work is timeless. He has this book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. Nouwen was just absolutely enamored by the painting of the prodigal son by Rembrandt. Just totally enamored. He even traveled to Russia where they had the original piece, the big piece, and they parked a chair in front of that manuscript or that beautiful masterpiece, and he sat there and he studied it for hours at a time. Its brilliance was just drawing him to it. And he marveled at every aspect of it. He marveled at the age of the Father's hands. He marveled that the Father looked weary, that he looked blinded. But yet here in this picture was this gentle touch and embrace into the bosom of the Father with the Son who had actually disowned his father and his entire family, vowing never to return, and according to tradition was not ever allowed to return. The filth of the son's life, if you remember the prodigal son, he had gone off, he'd spent his inheritance, and he had all that list, the immorality list, the sexual immorality and all the things that you weren't supposed to do. He did them. His soul was totally contaminated, and he had that come to Jesus moment to face the truth about himself. Not just his situation, but who he had become, who he had failed to be. And he turned home, not even knowing if he was going to be received, because tradition said he'd be stoned the moment he set foot in town. But he came anyway, hoping that maybe he could be a slave in his father's house. The filth of the son's ugly life. He came with all of that, the ugly moments that spilled out and contaminated his soul. It was painted on the son's face. You look, he was stripped of any dignity. His head is shaven. His clothes are the same as a slave. He has soul. He has sores on his soles and cuts on his back. This is his come to Jesus moment. Came after years of running away from who he was not, who he had feared he had become. And there was no certainty when he got there, but he came anyway. And there is his Father who embraces him, even though he is blind, weary from age, scarred by grief from a son that had lost. Some of you have lost sons and daughters or brothers and sisters or mothers and fathers who are not dead. They're just dead to you. And that's the contamination of the soul that this situation was dealing with. And the Father knows, though, who his Son is. The contamination, look at the picture. Look at how he's embracing his Son. The contamination is gone. The contamination is forgiven. It's healed. And the Father knows who the Son really is and who he is not. It's in the come to Jesus moments that you and I face that we have something to cling to, but Jesus knows us better than ourselves. Jesus knows we're not the slime in the back of our fridge. Jesus knows we are something better. Jesus comes to you in that moment when you face who you are to decontaminate any impurity that you might have that spills out of your life, wiping your fridge clean, even the stuff growing in the back. So often I ask somebody, what is their faith story? Like, what is their AA story? And the thing that I get is when you were baptized, when you're confirmed, when you were married in church, what church committees you are, whether you've been a good attender or a poor attender, how much you gave. I hear your church history. But folks, that's your church history. That's what you do. That's not who you are in the eyes of God. Your faith story is all those come to Jesus moments where Jesus has met you in those moments and has worked you through those moments, and you've gone on to another come to Jesus moment, and Jesus has worked into that moment and another, and when you string all those come to Jesus moments together, that's your faith story. That's your faith story of what Jesus has done in your life. And that's the story that people need to hear. Not how many years you've been a member of this church, but how many times Jesus has come to you in a moment that you needed Jesus, and how did Jesus pull you through it. These are the moments that define us and refine us. We face the ugly truth. We move through it because someone like Jesus has come to move us through it, moving us from ugly words like divorce into a new word like child of God, moving us from this ugly past of divorce into preacher. Those are the come to Jesus moments in our life. That's our grace and our forgiveness. Do you realize that every time you take Holy Communion, you are having a come to Jesus moment? Every time you come forward to take that bread and that cup, you are receiving the forgiveness and the acceptance of Jesus Christ. You are bringing who you are, all of the contamination, all of the ugly words that are inside of you, and you are coming forward to receive forgiveness and grace and acceptance. And the Father's embrace is waiting to meet you at the table. So today, when we have Holy Communion, what truth will you bring to the table? What truth will you leave there and never reclaim? God, you've got it. And what truth will you receive from God? Let us now prepare our hearts and our soul for this sacred come to Jesus moment as we break that bread of life and we share in the cup of salvation. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, as we enter into this moment of Holy Communion, fill our sanctuary with your presence, God. Fill our souls with your presence. Cleanse us of all those ugly words that contaminate us. Heal us like the touch of your garment, that we may be forgiven, and give us the assurance that we have. Amen.